Hello, everybody. The idea of these webinars, as you know quite well, is to talk about how we can mobilize and private capital to spark new solutions or novel solutions to social and environmental challenges. And in many cases, we have talked about different players and different actors of the ecosystem, especially what we call the mapping of the social capital, if you want, and try to see those that put impact first or those that also put financial first, but actually measure how they intentionally try to achieve certain impact by mobilizing investment flows. So despite the growth and the impact investment activity, and I think I have shown you in all these webinars how this sector is gaining momentum, still a lot of mainstream investors are not yet investing in impact at scale. So there are many cases where you're going to see, or even topics that are calling a lot of attention, especially in low-income populations. If you talk, we will see like financial services, agriculture, education, but it's not yet widespread. So we have talked about intentionality in impact investing, and when we had CERTAC at the very beginning of the webinars that you can review, because there's also a recording, we talked about the specificities of impact investing in Asia, but we did not talk a lot about geography and impact investing and how location or how geography could matter. So we really did not address how impact investment communities, for example, are more vibrant in certain regions or communities compared to others, and why. And if you look at the literature, academic literature, there are regional differences in entrepreneurial activities. And more those differences are explained by the vitality of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I felt that it was really a piece of the puzzle. If we want to think systemically, we cannot think only about investors or entrepreneurs, but we also need to integrate the interconnected forces that promote and sustain entrepreneurship, or this development of business models that drive solutions that respond to social and environmental challenges. So also in the literature, we are going to see that these ecosystems determine very key variables like the access to talent, to finance, to markets, and really there's a lot of evidence that countries that have vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems can produce economic development and community revitalization. So having Maryanne today is really a privilege, because it will help us to understand how can you work at the ecosystem level to strengthen and multiply the effect of mobilizing private capital for impact. So how can we really drive high impact solutions? And industry bodies like ANDE, that she will be represented today, really provide resources and services to grow the entire impact investing ecosystem. And they actually, if you go and look at their page, you will see they actually have a directory of non-financial, financial, other resources available, and many times other than the actions that they actually do directly. So they convene a lot of different organizations, social enterprises, investment firm, industry experts, etc., to promote best practices, to create partnerships, to increase the scale of the sector. And you've seen how important, I think if you have been following this webinar, how important collaboration is to really de-risk and to really scale solutions. They have invested more than $15 billion directly in what we're going to see as small growth businesses, and supporting more than 730,000 developing services, in capacity developing services. So really, it's a privilege to have Maryanne here. And before I introduce her a little bit more personally, please don't forget to write questions to the speaker, so I can include your questions and make it livelier. So Maryanne Ochola, she's a senior regional chapter manager for the Aspen network of development entrepreneurs, ANDE, as I mentioned, in East Africa. She's an impact investment professional with experience supporting early stage social enterprises in 7 African countries and to get them investment ready. You know, we have talked a lot during these webinars and also last webinar when we talk about the humanitarian sector, how do we build investment readiness? No, because in order for the private sector to bring capital, we need certain conditions, and we will talk a little bit more for this specific group that it is the small growth businesses. And she also has served as market advisor for a nonprofit organization in East Africa. And prior to that, she spent 9 years in commercial banking, including as a turnaround manager for distressed SME portfolio. So she has ample experience working in this field. She's also trained, and I think that's something that I find very interesting, as a financial journalist, and is very passionate about talking and building stories about economic growth in Africa. And a little confidence, she has an MBA from a business school and where I used to work, and she was my student in my last year at IE almost 3 years ago or 4 years ago in economic environment and country analysis. So it was more about macroeconomics, but I'm very happy to have kept in touch and to actually have her here. You know, so she's part of, as I mentioned, Aspen network of development entrepreneurs. It is a global network of organizations that propel entrepreneurship in emerging markets. And there are more than 280 and plus members in 150 countries and more than 91,000 small and growing businesses. And they're really based on the conviction that these small and growing businesses, we are the ones that will create jobs, stimulate long-term economic growth, and produce environmental and social benefits. And if you know, I lived in Peru. I'm originally from Argentina. And in developing economies, we always have this discussion because we have micro enterprises, small enterprises, and then we have very large ones. And we have this missing middle. So how do we get these job creating small businesses to scale up, to grow, to flourish? And we had Peter Woofley in our first webinar about talking about the valley of death, where a lot of companies disappear. So really to think about how we create a strong ecosystem so these solutions can scale up. So without much more introduction, so thank you, Maryanne, for being here with us. And let me ask you first initial questions. Why do you focus on small and growing businesses? Why are they important, and also especially in Africa, in the region that you work?
Yeah. So thank you, Vanina. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to everyone else joining the webinar. So we focus on small and growing businesses, first for a reason that you already mentioned, which is that on the entrepreneurial spectrum, we have your small businesses, which start small and are designed to stay small. But those are not the businesses that will move our economies forward. Then on the higher spectrum, we have large businesses, which are able to attract more commercial capital and are able to grow. But in between, we have what we call the missing middle, which are small and growing businesses, which are the ones driving growth. They are the ones driving growth in African economies. They are creating a multiplier effect on the local economy. They are grounded in their communities. So they're therefore creating inclusive economies, providing goods and services to perhaps parts of the markets that have been ignored, providing strengthening supply chains, providing energy access, water access to remote communities, spreading both environmental and agricultural best practices, creating jobs, improving quality to customers, providing value-added tax revenues to governments, and generally strengthening the broader community. So we're passionate about small and growing businesses, not just because of economic growth, but also because of the social and environmental benefits that these SGBs bring to their communities. So that's why we're very passionate about this category of entrepreneurship. And they also have a really growth mindset. So the idea is for them to grow. And when they grow, the communities as well will be uplifted. When we think about small and growing businesses, we have a strategy around how we think we'll be able to impact the strategy. And on the slide, I'll start from the bottom, what we call the central pillars. So one, as I've just done over the last 1 minute, is to make a passionate case for SGBs, because we believe they're drivers of local economy. But two is to increase effectiveness for organizations that support small and growing businesses. So this would be your typical ANDE member. Maybe an accelerator based in Kigali in Rwanda, maybe an impact investor based in Europe, but having a portfolio in West Africa and South Africa. How do we increase effectiveness for these organizations? And third, which is the topic for today, how do we cultivate entrepreneurial ecosystems with the belief that entrepreneurs do not operate in isolation? They are operating in an environment. There are all these many actors. How do we cultivate that system? But then in thinking about those sort of central pillars, we identify some very specific sector challenges, which are very perverse here in Africa. One of them is talent. Yes, there's talent, but it's an imperfect market. Sometimes investors, accelerators don't know where to find the talent. So how do we develop the talent landscape? Second, how do we improve impact investing in the ecosystem? And third, how do we actually measure our impact? Are we doing the things that we're saying we're doing? But finally, on the right, some urgent issues in acknowledgement that the SDGs are many, there are 17, but there are some where SGBs are perfectly placed to resolve. One of those is SGBs as drivers of decent work. The second is as drivers of gender equality, particularly here in Africa, where about 58% of women work as self-employed, in the self-employed workforce. So how do we drive gender equality? And third, climate action. It hasn't gone away because of COVID. It's still there. How do we drive entrepreneurial approaches to environmental action?
Good. So you're mentioning how you work in on cultivating these entrepreneurial ecosystems. What are these ecosystems? Why are they important? And what specific situation of entrepreneurial ecosystems in Africa are you focusing on or are more important to you? Your work.
Yeah. So when we think about ecosystems, we operate on the thesis that innovation is global. You know, when we talk about innovation, you know, we have fantastic stories coming out of Silicon Valley and of all these places, but we emphasize the role of a region as a critical nexus for innovation-based economic growth. So as a country, Kenya here, for example, we have state policies that create a platform for innovation, but innovation in Nairobi is not the same as innovation in Kisumu, which is a more rural town. So we look at a regional level. So be it Nairobi, be it Kampala, be it Kigali, where workers and companies and universities and research institutions interface directly, because we believe that it's a contact sport. It is how intimate those ties are. That's what grows ecosystems. The more fragmented they are, the weaker it is. The more tightly knit they are, the more it works. And that's our sweet spot. That's what we focus on, ecosystems.
And how do you do that mapping of the ecosystem? I know you work in South Africa and East and West Africa. How do you diagnose the strengths and the weaknesses that you find in an ecosystem in order to obviously, I imagine, to operate, you know, and if you can give us an example.
Yeah. So we pick a metropolitan area because we believe that ecosystems are based in, you know, metropolis centers. So we pick a metropolitan area like Abuja in Nigeria or Gauteng in South Africa. And we run surveys that ask the question, who is in that ecosystem supporting entrepreneurs, but what kind of support are you providing and to what level of entrepreneurs? And we're able to take all this information from individual actors and aggregate it into something we call a snapshot. So a snapshot is a moment in time. So we're saying in 2018, in Abuja, in Nigeria, 77% of organizations supporting entrepreneurs were providing support to startups and early stage businesses. 55% of them to idea stage. 11% were providing support to businesses at a mature stage. That way, actors coming in, be it a corporate foundation, be it a DFI, somebody who is setting up an accelerator program, you're starting from this base. which is telling you that maybe what we need is more support at this level and not this level. Because one of the things I've seen as an African living in Africa, especially with international development, is a lot of duplication. And we feel that sometimes, those resources could be better expended if we are working with the same template. And that's what the ANDE snapshots aim to achieve.
I know you have also an entrepreneurial ecosystem diagnostic tool. So if you can mention a little bit what that means.
Yeah. So the snapshots are one level. And what the snapshots do is they tell you who is there, what are they doing, and what level of support is still not available. Now, what a diagnosis does is it goes deeper. It uses a framework, and we call this domains, and maybe we can go to the next slide. We call this domains, and we try to deep dive into each of these domains and diagnose them one by one. One of the things that we appreciate about ecosystems is that ecosystems have competitive assets. And these competitive assets are how much finance is available, how much human capital is available, how much infrastructure is available. But ecosystems also have a culture. What is the culture of entrepreneurship in that ecosystem? And I'll give an example of some places in West Africa, for example, primarily like Francophone West Africa. It is more prestigious to work for a government, to get a public sector job. So you only become an entrepreneur if you fail at getting a job. So when you have a culture like that, entrepreneurship is not that celebrated. So that you have to consider that as an aspect of that ecosystem. So you have your competitive assets, you have your culture, and in between you have networks, which are formal and informal. And the question is, how do these networks carry the culture and the assets and provide a vibrant ecosystem? So we look at all these domains and diagnose an ecosystem on each and every one of them and ask ourselves, where are the strengths in this particular ecosystem? Where are the weaknesses? And therefore, what interventions would be best? And organizations like ANDE operating at that ecosystem level now focus down with that, together with the partners in that ecosystem.
We have an interesting question about this interrelationship between networks coming from Rohit, and he's asking, what are the major challenges faced in integrating these multiple regional networks? How are the potential challenges like regional and cultural nuances, as you were mentioned, addressed? So I think it's right in line of what you're saying. If you can give an example.
Thanks, Rohit. One of the other domains that we've come to appreciate, particularly when it comes to the culture question, is in addition to how an ecosystem finds its entrepreneurs, how it funds them, how it builds their capacity, the question of how does an ecosystem celebrate its entrepreneurs? And we find that that has a direct impact on the culture. I'll give an example of Nairobi, where the media is always hosting shows, shows of entrepreneurs who made it, how they made it. There's a website called How We Made It in Africa. It is stories like this that start to infuse it, particularly in the minds of young people. And Africa has a very large young population, still very impressionable. That is how you start to change the culture. That is one, celebration. The second one is trust. In ecosystem building, the fuel will always be trust. And trust takes time. Trust is constantly convening people together in formal gatherings, talking about their ecosystem, helping them take an ownership of that ecosystem. By building trust, you also start to infuse that culture. So those would be my two responses. And both of them take time. Yeah.
Aliane also added a question, and I think can also be part of the answer that you're saying, because I've seen a lot of these networks, or at least interrelating on issues like traditional cultural expressions in Africa, and dissemination of local cultures. And she's asking here if that can work as empowering or creating like creative territories of multiple or different regions. So have you seen networks around the creative industries?
Sorry, I didn't get the first part of that question.
The question is actually if the creative industries can be part of this kind of multi-region or different network ecosystem that is growing now.
Yeah, that is true. And we're actually seeing an upsurge in recognition of the creative industry, and not just the role that it has in economic development, which is true. And sometimes of populations who are usually marginalized, like low-income women, for example, in the handicrafts sector and things like that. So bringing them into the ecosystem, we're starting to see a lot of that. But also, how do you think about business models for that? So it's not just performative, it's also that people are actually seeing economic impact from that. And when that starts to happen, that you can celebrate your culture on one hand and make a living from it, that becomes quite powerful. So it's still a question of how do we grow these businesses so we achieve that dual function.
Great. So you mentioned the different pillars or the different issues that you use to diagnose an ecosystem. No? So, and then what? After you do this diagnosis, can you give us an example of an ecosystem where you work? Or I know you work in a case on Uganda, and can you mention a bit how do you work in practice?
Yeah. So we've been running snapshots for quite a long time. And we've had them in South Africa, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in Kigali. But for the first time, we're taking it to the next level and saying, what would it look like to do a deep dive into one ecosystem and then build an intervention around that? And we picked Uganda. One of the reasons why we picked Uganda is that in the 2015 Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Survey, Uganda was actually listed as the most entrepreneurial country in the world. But that is in startup rates. Yeah, the second piece of that equation is that in 2 years, a lot of those businesses are dead. So then the question of why, and that's where the ecosystem angle comes in. So with the support of the Agidius Foundation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and Small Foundation, we took a phase one approach where we said we're going to collect data on Uganda, but not Uganda as a whole, because of what I said that ecosystems are regional. We picked Kampala, which is the capital city of Uganda and essentially the commercial hub. And then we picked Gulu. Gulu is a northern city in Uganda. It's just coming out of years of civil war, and it's very agricultural. So look at this too, to demonstrate also that even within the same country, you can have two ecosystems, or more actually. And then we undertook a literature review of over 70 sources of data sets. So people have been in Uganda, people have been collecting data. So we picked 70 of those sources. We spoke to almost 180 SGBs in both of these markets, taking their perspectives. We spoke to other stakeholders. We had focus groups for ecosystem actors, governments, and then we held validation and dissemination workshops in 2018, where we presented that data back to the ecosystem, and we said, the strength in the Kampala ecosystem is that there is a huge catchment market. But then one of the weaknesses is that the tax regime is a bit opaque, and entrepreneurs keep their businesses small so that they stay out of the sight of the taxman. In Gulu, one of the strengths we found is that, yes, there's a very big national market for its agricultural products, but then physical infrastructure like electricity, like roads, hinder value addition, and therefore hinder how much revenue actually comes back to that ecosystem. So we presented that, and it was acknowledged. Those are our binding constraints. So now phase two, which is now an ecosystem initiative in action, is convening these actors together and saying, okay, we have a base, but can we problem frame? What are the one or two things that if unlocked for your ecosystem in Kampala, you feel entrepreneurship will go to the next level? And that will take time. We've actually given it 24 months for people to just convene in working groups and to define those issues and to come up with the responses themselves. And then once that happens, then we invite the international community, DFIs, funders. This is what this ecosystem has identified as its needs. And this is what...
Sorry, Darby, but Miriam is asking precisely a question on that. And I know you're very passionate about this side of how the problem solving comes in, because we had conversations on this. But she's saying, shouldn't investors in Africa give more attention to homegrown innovations from local teams who know the needs, the context, instead of importing innovations? from expat founders. No, so I think it goes in line. So how do you see that part of getting the bottom-up approach, and how do you work with that?
Yeah, I know I agree with that sentiment in particular, because what we are trying to do is turn it the other way around. Because what has been happening is that even the problem framing is not done locally. The problem is framed outside of the continent. The interventions are created outside of the continent, and then it's just application that happens. And as you can imagine, sometimes that doesn't work, actually most of the times. So what we are trying with this new approach is that it's the people in that ecosystem defining their challenges the way they see it. So external support is only coming in once that is clearly articulated, trust has been built, people are ready to collaborate. The only boost they need is perhaps financial or non-financial capacity building. Because as you have mentioned, what happens is that we get expatriates coming into the market because they already know what the problem has been defined as. They come and create a solution for what has been defined, and then they get all the money, and then the local community is still left with the same challenges. That's why I'm very passionate about this grassroots approach. When it comes to building, the ecosystems have to be built by the owners of that ecosystem. It cannot be done from outside the continent.
So what are you were talking about the binding constraints. What are the main that you identify, and you work precisely on this? And then we'll go to another question that precisely goes to these constraints. No.
Yeah. So one of the binding constraints that we identified is a lack of early stage finance. And then back to the challenge, to the question that has just been raised right now, one of the reasons why homegrown entrepreneurs continue to remain outside of the investment space is because ticket sizes available in the continent are quite high. You'll find investors who start at $2 million. What a homegrown entrepreneur needs is $20,000. But then for an investor, the cost of a $20,000 deal and a $2 million deal is sometimes the same, because the transaction cost.
Yeah.
Exactly. So early stage finance remains a challenge. But why is it a challenge? When we were asking these questions, we would ask why, the 5 whys. And one of them is small businesses just not having records, sometimes intentionally, because of the sort of misunderstanding with tax authorities. So you just don't want to have records. But then it creates a vicious circle, because if you don't have records, then you also will not attract investors. The second is a lack of management skills. And this is specifically to run a business. The entrepreneurship training programs in places like Makerere University, Nairobi University are very theoretical. They're not grounded in practice. That's why, for example, I went to IE Business School, because you're sort of having that practical training. The third is a lack of appetite for equity, and this goes back to culture. The idea that if I give you a part of my business, you will run away with it. So no, just give me debt, even when the cash flows to support debt repayments are not there. Then constraining requirements for bank debt, a lot of collateral. Yeah. But part of the reason is really because banks make more money investing in government equities sometimes than in taking the risk to invest in SMEs. Then pre and post BDS, business development services is costly, and sometimes articulating the value of that, a lot of entrepreneurs are not able to. And then this no unicorns, I think this is the other one that I keep harping on, because the problem framing outside the continent also comes expecting unicorns. The companies that are driving economies in Africa are not unicorns. They are moderate growth SGBs funded by family and friends. Those are the ones creating jobs. So the expectation of unicorns, I think, should be moderated, for investors who are coming onto the continent. And then finally, SGBs just not fitting the impact definition. A lot of the businesses we found in Kampala that are creating the most jobs are brick and mortar, trading, manufacturing. It's not your last mile energy business. It's not those impact businesses that are driving growth.
That's actually very interesting. And I think Rohit is adding that he grew up in Botswana and that the stock market was really not very liquid there. No, and I think you're mentioning this cultural side of equity and the problems of raising capital. No, so how how do you do this? No, so if the results of this is like slowing growth and a limited pipeline, no, so what is the solution? How do you work on that?
So I think, and particularly thinking about SGB finance, I think is to reset the expectation. To reset the expectation that there will be a 10x exit in the next 2-3 years, but to sort of come with the mindset that if you support businesses, and this is providing business development support to businesses that makes sense, they're commercially viable, they have the potential for high growth, but probably not now, or they're moderate growth, and they're looking mostly to raise less than 100,000 shillings. That's one of the binding constraints that we found. That's what is lacking. Why? Again, because businesses have weak management, records and systems, so they require heavy touch business development services. But then the challenge with heavy touch business development services is they're not commercially viable. So somebody will have to fund that as a public good. Otherwise, there'll be no pipeline upstream. Yeah. So it's sort of a vicious cycle. So that's one of the other binding constraints that we found. So the result is that, those providing early stage BDS, mostly grant funded. And sometimes the challenge with being grant funded is you're just focused on cohort in, cohort out, but not really on the quality of what you're doing, or you're very narrow focused because a funder only cares about energy. So you just take an energy cohort and that's what you focus on. So that imbalance is part of the challenge of pipeline growth.
Right. We have seen in these webinars sometimes the role of foundation or philanthropic impact investors on this early growth and precise in this part of where the transaction costs are very high, but there is at least a business model that is scalable, and also seen how sometimes with blended finance you can pull different small holders, but what is in your experience? So if we have all these challenges that make sometimes the African environment, and I would say many, I've seen very similar things in Latin America, so I don't think it's only for Africa, but quite challenging because this segregation, I think, or so what is the way forward? What can you do?
Yeah.
What are the actions you can take?
I think there's a lot of opportunity on this continent. You will find an entrepreneur with no external investment, with no BDS, still being able to make money off a business idea. But I think what needs to change is the expectations. And usually the expectations are, the bias comes from ecosystems elsewhere. So I think we need to take a fresh lens, especially if you're coming from outside, when you're looking at a challenge, and listen to the people in that ecosystem in terms of what a solution would look like. Co-create the solution with them. And we've seen a couple of particularly private foundations who are very entrepreneurial. We've seen some that actually come in, and I'll talk about the Agidias Foundation because I think they've demonstrated that you can come in and you can spread your support across a wide variety of actors and see what works and then double down on what works. And I think that approach is something that we're recommending, particularly when it comes to supporting enterprise support organizations who in turn understand their local contexts. So particularly in Uganda, one of the action pathways that we are proposing to those two challenges that I highlighted, early stage finance and patient and affordable business development services, is to strengthen, for example, the strengthening of credit reference bureaus are a very new idea. They're a very new idea. We're just building the capacity for data. And it's because of culture. A lot of people just want to keep their finances personal. So strengthening credit reference bureau, providing investors with that confidence using data. The second is tailoring financial instruments that are fitted for our markets. So maybe not equity at this point. It's leasing, it's factoring, because the business is about more efficient and affordable BDS for smaller SGBs. Yeah.
Okay, you froze for a second, so I think we lost you on piloting the tailored financial instruments. But I think we have talked a little bit in the webinars too, how we have a myriad of instruments, that it's not that we need to go from grant to equity directly, no, or you do one or the other, and that how you tailor that and you build that understanding what is the problem that you want to solve, you know. So we also had a question, let me think, especially on those enablers that you mentioned before, on let me see, from Ravi, how do you do this high quality mentorship, or how do you support the legal and taxation and logistics services in the developing nations? You know, how do you unlock that side of the story in order to be able to have all these financial instruments working later on? You know?
Yeah, I think the first place to start with that is, you know, when it comes to support services like mentorship, like legal advice, like taxation advice, sometimes entrepreneurs come from a bit of a cynical view, and that's because of programs that have promised this and did not deliver, because the entrepreneur was not really the customer. The customer was the donor, you know, the person that was supporting that program. So once the provider of mentorship said 600 entrepreneurs mentored, they had done their job. So I think it's starting from first demonstrating value, and that might still be subsidized. You know, setting up one-stop shops. And we have an example here, for example, in Nairobi, where a Kenyan recently set up the first of its kind. They're calling it a sandbox. It has a tax expert in there. It has a HR expert. It has an accountant, you know, a sort of one-stop shop where an entrepreneur comes and is able to test this, and it's results-based. So you only pay for the services once a certain, and you agree on what that result is. I want to be able to raise this much, or I want to be even a modest one. I want to be able to take my revenue from this much to this much. Then once that starts to be demonstrated to entrepreneurs, I think the case to pay will be there. A lot of entrepreneurs can pay for these services. It's just that understanding of value has not yet been demonstrated. But a lot of ANDE members have been able to start to demonstrate that. And we ran an initiative called the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative together with Emory University. And this is collecting data from entrepreneurs before they join acceleration and after they join acceleration. And then comparing it to the control group of those that were rejected. And then tracking metrics around revenue growth, around how much, and what we demonstrated is that for every dollar put into acceleration, that was multiplied in revenue or in grants access. So for us, for organizations like ANDE, is to continue to build the evidence to demonstrate that. But for actors coming in, I think it's fast to articulate to entrepreneurs that these services are valuable and they will pay.
I think it's very, I did last year a discovery expedition with executive MBAs from IMD to Peru, where they were actually doing a due diligence. So because I didn't want the students from a top university to go as consultants and give advice to people that have been doing business for 10, 15 years. No? And again, and it was this idea of finding value. So they had to go and listen and actually pitch to impact investors. So convey the value. And it was interesting because at the beginning, they thought that none of these businesses were investable. No. And at the end, they ended up, some of them investing their own money and supporting the entrepreneurs. So how do you get to know people and build that trust and perceive what value is in emerging markets? It's different than when you're prepackaged sometimes solutions of what you think it works from the developed side. So how does ANDE catalyze action? No, what are you needed? Why do we need somebody like you that works on the ecosystem, putting these pieces together to enable impact investors to come and multiply impact? Yeah.
So I think one of the things I mentioned earlier was how important trust is, and the many ways in which trust has been lost through programming. So because of trust, why ANDE is important is because we are a neutral actor. We are not making investments. We're not building capacity for entrepreneurs ourselves. So that neutrality, I think, is perhaps our biggest selling point as an ecosystem builder. The second is that over a period of 10 years, we've been able to bring together organizations that are essentially competitors to come together and think about ways they could collaboratively address some of these ecosystem challenges. And the third is that we've also been able to advocate for greater funding for investments, both into the SGBs directly, but also into the organizations that support SGBs in this market. So by making the case for SGB, for the sector, to donors, to agencies, to foundations, and to continuing to be a neutral actor in the ecosystems that we work, that we have found to be very impactful. The second thing we do is we do a lot of research. And this particular report here, Fueling Entrepreneurship in Emerging Markets, actually tracks how 20 major funders are supporting small and growing businesses. The largest 10 of them come from Europe. And it's to really use that to encourage others as a more sustainable way of addressing economic development in emerging markets. And on the extreme right is a picture of our executive director, our managing director, constantly in conferences saying the ecosystem should matter. An ecosystem view should matter to each and every one of us because it actually de-risks your investments. Whether you're an impact investor, commercial banker, it de-risks your investments.
No, and we have seen in other webinars too how important research and science-based targets and best cases or best practices to learn from. So, and how that also investors look for that before they do interventions. So, and part of what we want to do at the LEA Center and part of these webinars too is this idea of convening different players, because I think it's part of building that understanding to achieve solutions, hopefully later at scale. There is something that is also kind of a big elephant in the room lately as we start in some countries reopening. And I think gladly in Africa, I think COVID was expected to be a disaster. It has, hopefully it's not just yet that things are not as bad as, for example, what you can see in Latin America. But we have seen big disruption. And I know you've been working like crazy on some of this backup story on how to address the issues. So what are the implications for small and growing businesses of the COVID crisis? And is the pipeline of entrepreneurs of these businesses at risk, or is it more on the supply side? Are the funders disappearing? What do you see? How are what is happening from the demand side of entrepreneurs, and what is happening from the supply side with the money, if you want, of the owners of capital? If you can tell us a little bit on what you're working on.
Yeah. So I think first is to just double down on what you've said. I think when this started, everyone was saying, oh, in Africa, it will be a disaster. And so far, and touch wood, it hasn't panned out to be, that. But that does not mean that the broader impacts have not impacted the SGB ecosystem. One, because a lot of our supply chains are global, not just in Africa, but also in other countries. So if you're an SGB and you're getting your supplies from China, you're not able to fulfill, for your own customers. But then the second thing is also when it comes to investments, a lot of investments are coming from areas which are epicenters. So that in itself is an impact. So what we did in March when this started is we carried out a member survey. Out of our membership, what was the impact? What were they seeing in terms of the impact of COVID on their organizations and on the SGB portfolios that they serve? And we found that 42% of small and growing businesses in emerging markets were going to fail over the next 6 months. A substantial amount had cash reserves of only 4 to 8 weeks. And then because of that, investors are also doubling down on their portfolios. So the people they've already invested in, patching them up in terms of cash flow, and not really on the, out looking for new deals. Exactly. And then because of the fact that, again, a lot of investors are based outside of the continent, the lack of travel for due diligence also impacts, the development of that new pipeline. So that's one of the findings that we found. The second one was on the enterprise support organizations themselves. They themselves struggling with cash flow, and how that impacts SGBs is that supporting them to adapt their business models to this new environment then is also directly impacted. So what our recommendations were is more flexible financing for SGBs, on account of everything that is happening, and more support for small and growing businesses directly. Then we are already thinking forward, in 2021 and beyond, that if now there's a dearth of impact investing, it means a lot of money will be available after this because people are not meeting their own targets as investors. The businesses that will have survived this will be very well placed for that. So we are focusing on resilience. How do we build resilient SGBs? And we keep joking that if you're a business in Africa, you're already resilient. All the challenges
by definition.
By definition.
I'm Argentinian, I feel for that. I know what that means.
Exactly. So we hope that this actually shifts the landscape, that we can start to see homegrown entrepreneurs who have nowhere else to go. This is their community, as actually the bets that we need to focus on when we think of adaptation post-COVID.
We have two interesting questions that I will put together about the role of multinational corporations or of corporates in general. As you know, at IMD, and usually we have a large public or audience of corporates. And Ravi is asking, what would one expect from multinational companies that are present in these localities? What can they practically do? Should they be a requirement of sourcing locally or having local partners in the supply chain? And I know that international global inclusive supply chains is a big issue in general. Yeah. And Romain is asking, and he's saying, actually, I work in East Africa selling fragrances to manufacturers of cosmetics and personal and home care products. I focus on national leaders, and he mentions a few, but often cannot work with SGBs because they're too small in terms of revenue. Nevertheless, we wish to select high potential prospects. What tools do you use for this high potential? So what is the role? Because sometimes when we talk about this ecosystem, we tend to go to the traditional, to the government or to foundations, but what can be the role of multinational corporations? Are they part of the players that you work with, and how, and if you can give some advice of how to include them in the impact side?
When you said that, this example came to my mind. The moment this was declared, there was a lot of rush for, say, hand sanitizers. And where you find them in March, you buy the whole shelf. So I know two actors. So Dettol, on the one hand, which has been providing the small size hand sanitizer, and then Unilever with the Lifebuoy brand. So what happens very quickly is you couldn't find a single Dettol hand sanitizer anywhere. Why? Because their manufacturing, all of it is offshore, and there was a serious disruption once this hit. But what happened with Lifebuoy is they quickly pivoted and they were able to find a local manufacturer. What that means is that Lifebuoy has captured a market share that they just didn't have. So now even I, who used to use a Dettol, I use a Lifebuoy because I know I will constantly find it. So the response here, I find, one of the things that COVID has taught us is how fragile global supply chains can be. Yes, they are efficient. Yes, they are profitable, but they are also very fragile to disruptions, and therefore a need to build regional supply chains, which are more resilient, which are more responsive. And I sympathize with, the attendee who talked about
Oman.
You're not able to work with, SGBs because they're small, and then there's all this quality, and corporates usually have a very high threshold. For example, for quality. But I think that when I think about corporates, they're a bit removed, even in our ecosystems. Investors and accelerators and all these people are talking, but corporates are usually very removed. So I think this is an opportunity for them to also just, who do I need to talk to? Networks like ANDE, networks like, the Kampala Angel Investment Network, all these networks, and just find out, because there's something they know that you perhaps do not know. Just given
so they can come to you, they can come to ANDE, because something that we talk. There might be that corporates sometimes are removed, but also a lot of ecosystems on the impact side did not consider corporates as partners. No, and last week we had a humanitarian ICRC, the Red Cross, with an asset manager, a bank like Lombardo. And so part of that dialogue on building, because they can mobilize also private capital and corporate impact investing and including them in the value chains. No, so I think it is a player, and I'm glad Roman brought that up. But I do think that it's interesting, the idea that you were mentioning of the regional value chains, and we're seeing a lot of at least here in Switzerland, I don't know, consume local. No, so do you think that the African continent, or if you want, these different ecosystems can profit for that to strengthen and first grow locally and maybe then go global? Do you think that tendency could strengthen, or the opposite? They were so trying to get into global value chains that this will hit them and have less demand. What do you think? Is it an opportunity or is it a threat?
I think it's a big opportunity. And particularly with there's a new generation of Africans, and I constantly say that demographic bulge in Africa is a massive opportunity, because it's also a mindset shift. A lot of young people are very keen on buy Kenya, build Kenya. You see this all the time. You go to Rwanda, there's buy Rwanda, build Rwanda, and this sentiment is quite strong. So what we need is to pull together and build local ecosystems. I think there's a lot of strength in doing that and just riding on that wave of a new generation of Africans that are keen, to build local, not just global.
Good. There is Roman actually wrote a couple of posts saying, yes, we were able to send the formula hand sanitizer. So I think your example hit home. So Anne Roulin is asking also a question. She finds the session very interesting first, but she's saying also one of the key problems she finds is the high cost of due diligence, and this transaction cost, it's a big issue. Do you see, as working on the ecosystem side, do you see any initiative? She's talking about part of the technological solutions, but is there a way to somehow work in collaboration so this transaction costs become more manageable and the projects obviously less risky? That is a big challenge usually, but one of the things we're banking on, and we're starting to see that at a small scale, is digitization and how much value a lot of organizations are finding from that. Again, linked to the youth bulge is there's a lot of, technology awareness and uptake, a lot of smartphones on the continent. So we can leverage that, I believe, to cut. We have a legacy of infrastructure problems, roads and ports and these things. But I think there's value in focusing on the technology that we have on the continent and building local platforms, local solutions to sort of cut back. But I agree with you, that's a big challenge. Have you seen, because we see that high transaction cost and low ticket size is an explosive combination, no? But we had several webinars on blended finance, and we had one, for example, with BNP Paribas working in sustainable rubber in Asia, that actually they got involved after there was a joint venture that put a lot of small holders together and actually. So do you see these kinds of initiatives that can come from cooperatives or can come from others that actually put these small holders in certain industries that then can go to larger ticket type of investments?
So we've seen, I think on the higher spectrum of that, we've seen blended finance working in PPPs. We've seen a lot of capital coming into infrastructure development, de-risking, more commercial capital. What we're yet to see is that happening at this level, at this early scale. And there's a lot of opportunity, but particularly for money that has traditionally been used in aid, the old way of aid. I think if there's a way to transition that into fast loss capital, a lot of private investors would crowd in, and we're hoping to do that with some of the initiatives that come out of places like Uganda. And as ANDE ourselves, we're doubling with that, putting together a blended finance vehicle to test that.
I think it's what I see very promising. So I've seen that role of the DFIs and aid agencies shifting to the first laws to enable entrepreneurial and crowding private capital now and bring more private capital. But I also seen corporates that have value chains tied and wanted, like we have Roman mentioning, to include these SGVs, playing a role as uptakers of these. And I think that I'm started to do research on that and talking to a lot of corporates, because they can be part, again, if we change this mindset, they do have these value chain problems and they want to be sustainable and they want traceability and they want a lot of other things, and they can play a role. So, but
actually,
time is yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just a quick example. So Safaricom is the largest telecom in Kenya. And we've seen them doing that with Citi and getting finance for their suppliers, who are typically small and growing businesses. So we like that, that thinking around shared value. We just need to see a lot more of it, particularly in the corporate space.
Great. So it's almost out of time, and thank you so much for this amazing conversation. If you had to mention some takeaways or lesson learned or something you want to leave us with, or last parting thoughts, what would be that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I want people to leave with is that Africa is investable. Africa has opportunity, it has returns, but we need to be ready to learn, and learn from the local context, and to be part of ecosystems with people who are already working there. But if there's one thing I want people to live with, is that Africa is investable and there's opportunities on the continent. But organizations like ANDE and people who are already here are happy to speak and to collaborate and to find ways to sort of go around some of those problems.
So thank you so much, Maryanne. And I'm very happy to have this webinar with you and talking about ecosystems. And I think it's the same idea goes for the Lea Center for Social Innovation. We believe in that side of partnership, and that the solutions will not come individually, that we need to collaborate and bring different assets, and also this idea of understanding value and understanding how you convey that value and the innovation. So thank you very much to everybody. Thanks for the very lively participation. And I hope next week we will not have a webinar, because IMD has a very special week where we do orchestrating winning performance live. It's a very innovative program that I recommend you to look up. And I'll be doing some sustainable finance session in OWP, but I'll be back after the following week on July 1st. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Maryanne, for this great conversation.
Thank you, Vanina, for having me.
Bye-bye. And see you in 2 weeks.
All right, see you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.